So worldwide, bee populations are declining, absolutely. In Australia, we have over 1,660 different species of native bee. Most of the literature is related to the European bee, which is an imported species. And yes, they have many issues with regards to pests and disease. And then a few decades ago, there was the whole colony collapse disorder, which has affected colonies worldwide significantly. So yes, it's still problematic. With regards to native bees, because our research is still so thin on the ground, we focus very heavily on European bees. Again, I find that extraordinary, but the research has only just started happening with regards to our native species that are here in Australia. We don't actually know the numbers, say 10 years ago, to identify whether or not there's been a shift in the past decade. So that research is only just beginning. I'm hoping that the funding will keep coming as well to allow us to discover these things. But I think ultimately, if you think logically, given that in Queensland we have such a high rate of land clearing, ultimately bee numbers are going to be affected. It only makes sense.
And what happens to that population once the land's cleared? What happens? Like, do they just perish as a collective, or do they try and find, or do they kind of migrate to whatever's next? Yeah.
A bit of both, actually. So yes, some colonies will just disintegrate into nothing, and there have been great losses. There have been great losses as a result of our climate issues. So obviously we're getting hotter climates and hotter temperatures, and that has been problematic because we're also getting greater periods of drought. And when we have drought, we have no nectar in the flowers. So the bees start starving. So there's so many factors that have been problematic for our native bees. But as with anything, and our native bees are extraordinarily intelligent, I think, in ways that we don't necessarily understand, there are species that are migrating. So of our stingless bees, they are geographical, so they tend to have certain species in certain areas. We're noticing a shift in those areas. So species are moving to different locations. That is happening.
Right. And I guess the idea that climate change is this huge kind of big concept that is difficult, but it's getting more clearer over time to really comprehend. It's a big picture conversation, but something is, something like bees, it actually affects, climate change does have a real effect on bees. And from the reading, and what I know is that bees have this real beauty, this idea that without the bee, a lot of other things are gone as well.
Yeah, I do think up until recently, because a bee is such a small creature, it tends to just fly under the radar a bit. People don't notice it so much as they should, perhaps, because despite the fact that it's a mini creature, it's a mighty creature. It does amazing things in terms of pollination. And the bee is essentially responsible for much of our food security. So even though a lot of our foods that are in our Western diet aren't insect pollinated, a lot are. So I don't know about you, but I love blueberries and watermelons and lychees and avocados and macadamias, tomatoes. All of these things will be affected by population losses of bees.
And how is it affected?
Well, just to give you an example, tomatoes are self-pollinating, but we do have a special bee called a blue-banded bee. She has a superpower called buzz pollination, and she's one of few that can do this special type of pollination that the tomato flower responds to. Now, even though the tomato is self-pollinating, it actually will show increased yield, quality and quantity if it's insect pollinated. So the current research is investigating how the blue-banded bee can do commercial crops in greenhouses for tomatoes. So given that our population as humans is expanding greatly, I mean, we can have access to tomatoes, but is that going to be an issue to get access to tomatoes in a decade if we're not getting the yields that we want? If we have looked after our bee colonies, and if we have healthy, thriving bee colonies that can do that pollination service, then our food security is going to be a lot tighter. We're going to be assured that we can get the food when we need it.